Welcome to the Path to CPO, where we peel back the layers of success and delve into the journeys of the most dynamic chief people officers. I'm your host, Nelson Sibalingam, CEO and co-founder of How Now. Together, we'll explore the trials, the triumphs, and insights of these trailblazers across people, culture, and HR at some of the fastest growing companies in the world. This is not just their story, it's a roadmap for all aspiring people leaders. Tune in, rise up, and let's embark on this enlightening journey together. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Nelson. Great to be here.
All right, I'm gonna take you down memory lane to kick off with. I'm gonna ask you, what was your first role in HR?
Yeah, it's a great, memory lane. It's a long, long time ago during the dot-com boom of the late 90s. Well, before I get into that, I can talk about, so I am an accountant actually by study, and a failed accountant by practice. So I really didn't like it, and I wasn't really good at it. So I actually got fired. My first job ever was an accountant role, and I got fired from it. And it was a career pivot for me. And I went back to the recruiting firm and I said, hey, I really don't like this accounting stuff. What can I really do? And they're like, well, you can go to finance. And of course, in New York at that time, finance was a big deal. Or you can, maybe come and recruit for us. And I said, I don't know what recruiting is all about. They're like, don't worry about it. You can talk about accounting. You can recruit. And I started my recruiting career at Robert Half, doing recruiting for accountants, and then expanded into that. But that's my first taste into the HR space was recruiting for Robert Half.
How long into your first HR gig before you started to think, actually, you know what, I could build a career in HR? How long did that take?
Well, it's interesting because Robert Half was a really good place to, I almost called it a recruiting boot camp. I learned a lot of habits there, but it wasn't the greatest place from my perspective at the time to be doing recruiting. It was a great place to learn recruiting, but I had an opportunity in the next phase to work for an executive search firm, and I pitched them. I saw this huge momentum that was happening in these tech startups in New York during the first dot-com push. And I said, there's an incredible opportunity for us to really grab onto market share here and do recruiting for these companies. And thank goodness it's a small boutique search firm, and the owner was like, listen, there's minimal risk for me to take this on. And I built a practice. So I knew within the first, it was more of a recruiting kind of interest, but also just tech and building startups. I really got bit by the startup bug by going into these young companies and helping them to recruit. And then eventually they needed HR. They had no HR experience. Neither did I. And so I started learning and reading up on HR and doing employee manuals, and started just kind of accidentally got into the HR space and started providing some consulting services as well as recruiting for these small little startups.
And is that where the kind of, looking at your LinkedIn profile, you've been an advisor for the who's who of kind of startups. And is that where that kind of stems from, is starting to work with startups, advising them on how to bring in early people practices?
Absolutely. And well, it's interesting, the career itself. So getting into that space started my career. And I like to say I got a PhD in startup, because none of what we've learned in the real world is ever going to be taught in a classroom. It's just for me, my experience is there's just no level of building a company, scaling a company, closing a company. You're never going to learn that in a textbook. But the advisor roles that I'm doing right now are less about HR and recruiting and more about taking those experiences and helping those companies. You'll see in a lot of the advisory services they do, they're for HR, tech, and services company. So I kind of jump on the business side within those companies, and I help them with pricing on their product. I help them with actual product marketing. I do all these really interesting things because I take all those experiences and all those HR systems that I put in place during my career and helping them go to market and really I do sales enablement, a whole bunch of different things. So it's on the advisor side, it's less about the HR and recruiting stuff for them, but more about their business needs and commercial needs.
I'm now jumping around a bit, but I have to ask you something related to that. So that kind of commercial involvement, right, from everything from kind of product marketing to, like you said, pricing in itself. Yeah, how has that helped you in your role as CPO?
Well, I think it expands sort of the business side of my brain. And that's kind of, and not to say that when I'm in HR, I don't have that side, but it's really experiencing a whole different view of how businesses operate. So I can help consult Suzy's own product and product marketing folks. But when I'm doing it, I understand what they're going through, what the challenges are. So it gives me a greater sense of empathy for them. But also can help them and think about their businesses a lot better. Because I think I've always felt like the great HR folks tie the HR stuff to the business stuff, even if it's loosely tied. But if we can directly correlate these things even better. If I'm getting experiences where this startup is asking me about product market fit, like we went through a pricing scenario with one of the startups I advised. And it was just fascinating to go through that stuff. And then when the executive team at Suzy's talking about pricing, I can provide my point of view on that from the experience that I had on the other side. So it really gets me and puts tentacles into every part of our organization. And oftentimes, like, because I have an accounting background, I always surprise CFOs when I could read balance sheets and income statements. They always are very surprised that I'm able to read those things. Same thing here. When I'm talking about pricing, people are like, why is the HR guy talking about pricing? But they're like, oh, actually, that makes sense. And I tell them where the experience comes from. So it's been really incredibly helpful for me on the HR side.
And at what point in the journey did you, I guess, have the ambition to want to become a CPO, right? Was it accidental landing there, or was it quite deliberate and intentional that one day you knew your trajectory was to get to this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think all these roads are always somewhat accidental. Like I forget, there was a cartoonist that wrote there's just sort of no natural trajectory for certain things. There are certain roles that obviously have a natural progression, but I think most careers are accidental. My career in HR and recruiting is accidental. I went back to the recruiting firm at Robert Half and I said, what can I do with this thing? I don't want to do accounting. So that part was accidental, but I always felt like, okay, how do I get into that CPO role? And I've had such incredible mentors at that level within my toolbox, within my personal and professional toolbox. There was, when I was at Fresh Direct, I was coming into an organization that had a big hourly workforce that I had not worked with before. And so I looked at folks in that space. So Artie Nathan was the head of HR for Wynn Resorts, so in Vegas. So he built the Bellagio, right? So recruiting quickly and building this hourly workforce. Vinny Stabile, rest his soul, was the head of HR at JetBlue. Again, so I had these two mentors to help me with this. And I always knew, like, I wanted to be like them to a certain degree, being at that sort of CPO, the decision-making level. So I always knew I felt like I wanted to be there, but I also knew that I didn't have the right experiences or the right sort of mentorship until I had those folks being able to mentor me and coach me.
And one of the things I find, speaking to people who are people leaders, there's often this trying to find the right balance between being a generalist, but also having particular areas that you are specialists in. How do you balance the two? And I guess, how did you land on what your areas of specialism would be?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's hard, especially at the CPO level, because you're remit. So I try to simplify and storytell on HR in this way. So I think of HR, the remit for HR is what I call find, keep, and elevate, which is ironically the same as the tagline in my book. It's recruiting, it's the people operations, the keeping of the folks, and then the elevating of folks, right? So you need to find them, you need to keep them, and you need to elevate them. And obviously that is super high level, and there's so many different pieces within that. I think you have to be a generalist. I think if you're going to be a CPO someday, you've had to fill out a benefits form or negotiated benefits for a company or done recruiting or built a learning and development. I don't think unless you're in a very large company where you have the scale of all these different teams, I think in startups, it's hard not to be a generalist. You have to be. And that's my advice for folks. I think you have to dive into each one of these areas and you have to be at least knowledgeable about it. It may not be the most passionate piece, but again, I feel like HR from a strategic perspective, there's the plumbing and the electricity of HR, which are your benefits, your payroll. They're not always the sexiest pieces, but I will tell you that if you go into your apartment this evening, try to flip on the switch and the light doesn't go on, it's going to ruin your night. It's going to be like, what is going on? Why is the bulb, the electricity, but if you went the same day and just flipped it on and the light went on, you wouldn't even think twice about it, right? So those important fundamentals of HR, I think you have to get those right. And then you have to build the generalist. And then you could pick, okay, what is going to be sort of my point of view? You don't necessarily have to be a specialist in any way, but you have to be, you have to have a point of view about certain things. Now, there could be a broader point of view or it could be specific, right? Right now, I've put my hooks into this AI movement, right? So this, for me, I see very clearly is going to fundamentally change HR in so many different ways. So it's not necessarily, so I'm trying to learn as much as possible. I'm watching TikToks. I'm getting all sort of AI newsletters. I won't say I'm an expert in AI or data science by any means. And that's, but I'm understanding the business aspects of it. And I think that's a key. It's not just being a specialist, but maybe identifying an area of innovation in HR and sort of putting your hooks on that and becoming sort of a thought leader around those kind of things.
I guess just building on what you just said, Anthony, how do you deal with, for example, the kind of scaremongering that surrounds anything innovation tech, and especially around AI, right? How do you deal with, there might be people genuinely worried in the organization or people outside in your network about losing their job to AI? As a kind of HR professional, how do you think you can tackle this? How do you manage this and support people along that journey?
Sure. I think it's becoming a historian of these things. I think that's an important there's a reaction that's always going to be the case, right? If you look at neuroscience, our sort of inherent reaction to things is fight or flight. That's sort of how we're built. So any kind of change, there's this fight or flight syndrome that we have or reaction to it, right? So think about that and empathize with the folks that are within your organization and try to look at it. So you may have a position to say, listen, I think AI is going to be a game changer for us. And I think it's a necessary part of what we're trying to do. But when it comes to your employees, I always tell leaders, whenever they're communicating good or bad news, you have to think of it from the employee's perspective. Often companies will talk about it's great for the company. At the end of the day, that's great, and we want to send that message out. But you also, they don't give a crap about, they care about themselves. How is this going to impact me? And I think when you become a historian of these things and you look at the history of the workforce and automation, you'll find that there's a great image, and I forget where it is, but it's an image of an old bowling alley. I'm thinking it's a black and white, so it had to be in the early 1900s. But before there was automation, we actually had human beings and sometimes children actually replacing the pins in a bowling alley. You haven't even thought about that. That hasn't even been a whisper, but that was a job at one point. Someone's job was to do that. Years ago, we're not too short distance, and there's still some remnants of this. There were toll takers, particularly in New York here. Now everything's automated. So there's always going to be disruptions. I think what we need to figure out is one, be a historian. How has automation interrupted jobs and evolved jobs, right? There are now, while you no longer have the toll taker, you have the repair person for that automated toll device, right? So now that has created a job that didn't exist. Social media didn't exist. Now we have social media strategists. Chat GPT. If you don't say Chat GPT once a day, the AI gods are not fulfilled. So I said Chat GPT today. Good for you, AI gods. But anyway, Chat GPT has now created prompt engineers. The prompt engineer didn't exist 6-7 months ago, right? But now that's all we're talking about. Now I heard I forgot what it was called, deep prompting or major prompting. So now this is the evolution of that. So I actually read and be a historian, but read up on these things and understand all positions, right? What's the positive? What's the negative? and come up with your own conclusion. There's a great book on this. It's called Race Against the Machines, written by Andrew McAfee and Eric. I'm not even going to attempt his last name, but they're both MIT professors. And what they did is they looked at the Ken Jennings, IBM Watson from years ago and said, okay, this is going to create panic. Who's going to win? Is it the humans? Is it the computers? And what they came at the end of their book, their conclusion was, it's not people or computers. There's going to be things that computers do better than people. There's going to be things that people do better than computers. It's the combination of those two. So my advice is, be a historian, learn about these things, and don't put your head in the sand. Like, these things are going, there, and there's a cliche out there now. It's like chat GPT or AI is not going to take your job. A person that uses chat GPT and AI is going to take your job. And that's actually a pretty fair statement.
It's interesting because I was at an event not long ago, and I met this person who is a voice actor, and it wasn't really a role that I'd really thought about until this lady said, actually, it's really difficult right now because AI is able to create a very human sounding voice now, which essentially makes voice actors quite redundant, right? If you can turn text to voice, then it sounds quite natural. And she goes, yeah, so I'm out here trying to promote, but I'm not too sure how long it's going to last. So there's definitely, we're seeing those roles that will be affected. And I think what's been interesting is, there's typically high skilled roles that we've always assumed won't be replaced, but actually they're the roles that are being replaced. Like, for example, an engineer, I've seen it in my lifetime where, everyone was being promoted to go study coding, become an engineer. But actually now that's the first thing that AI is able to kind of at scale quite do. So it's quite an interesting period of time. I'm just kind of building on from that. How do you see this impacting, for example, organizational design and the number of people you'd need to recruit? Because what's becoming quite apparent is, where you may have needed 5 content writers before, actually now you just need one who's going to curate what AI is going to write. And probably the same for coding and many other areas. Does this come into play when you're thinking about, okay, what does scaling this organization look like?
Yeah, of course. It definitely does. I mean, if you think about, again, if you're a historian, sorry, it's Monday, I apologize. On these things, you look at it and say, okay, years ago, whether it was tech companies or enterprise companies, they touted the fact that they employed large sets of people, right? Like you look at the amount of revenue per employee of a Kodak or companies years ago, and it was very small. Now the proliferation of technology, cloud computing, now we can scale up, and the lean startup methodology from a bunch of years ago is professing you don't need all those people. So we've seen this movie before. So this is why it's so important to become a historian on these things, because you want to be able to look at these things and say, like, for some folks, generations that are new, whether it's Gen Z or millennials, they're going to be like, oh, this is the first time, but it's not. Like, that's the beautiful thing about the world, is a lot of what we'll see today is some sort of iteration of something that's already happened. We're seeing that now again with this. So yes, absolutely. I think you're going to see, but fundamentally, I want to be clear. Like, it's not just, hey, let's not hire a content writer ever again, because there are some things that will trip you up with ChatGPT. Like, if you're trying to get SEO and you're putting into ChatGPT, there are now systems that can flag that for AI creation, right? So there's a lot you're still going to need. Again, I think the equation here is less humans. Absolutely. No question about it. I mean, we've seen it. In HR, I put a job description in there. It spits out a job description. I put it into another system to scramble it so it's not AI generated. And now I'm using that. Usually that took a recruiter about 30 minutes, 45 minutes. That's done in 5 minutes, right? So I think it's going to create efficiencies and absolutely the scale. I'm really excited. I actually just posted about it this weekend. There's this auto GPT, so call it AI 2.0, which is this autonomous agent that goes out and does tasks. I haven't seen it. I've tested it. Some of it is a bit fairy dust to a certain degree. And if it could do what it says it could do, this, I think, is going to be even a wilder change than we see with the Chat GPT stuff. Yeah, Chat GPT can give you a content, it can give you a process, it can put together a plan. This can actually do all of that and then execute on that. And I talked about recruiting, right? Hey, go find me 15 software engineers based on this job description. Reach out to each one of them, see if they'd be interested in meeting with Suzy. If they are, please email this email address. And of course, then the human comes into it and we interview them, right? That is game changing. Like, think about that's going to be sales, marketing, content, all this sort of stuff. So there's so much going on in this space. And if Auto GPT lives up to the hype that I currently see, that we're going to have all these digital autonomous agents out in the world. So what's going to happen is you're going to have all of this stuff happening, and the ROI, it's like, email marketing versus direct mail. When it came out, the ROI was a lot better because it was cheaper. It was so much cheaper to do than direct mail. But they're still direct mail. And what happens now is direct mail is a differentiator because you're getting all these emails. And now when you get a package at home, you're like, oh, let me open this up. We have your attention now, where before. So I think we're going to see sort of an evolution of these things, and we're going to bring humans back into the process to humanize it. So it's going to be a really interesting next couple of years.
Definitely. I think we've been playing around with Auto GPT, and I think what stands out more than the fact that the technology is incredible, it's the fact that, before it used to take years for iterations on a new bit of technology. Now we're seeing it in weeks. And I think that's what's incredibly mind blowing. But I don't want AI to hijack our chat. And I want to bring you back to,
of course it does.
I just want to go, what is it that you know now that I guess you wish you knew in the early parts of your HR career, right? What do you know now?
Yeah.
Wish you knew before?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we had years ago the inclination that all this stuff we were doing and focusing on HR had business impact, but we never could really tell the story through data and analytics. And now we can. There's so much research and so much studies and case studies and data now that show, like, hey, if you do all these things in HR, if you create great leadership programs, if you focus on employee engagement, if you focus on employee performance, that actually has a direct business impact. And I think with the evolution of the company going from what I'll call tangible assets, so this is, cars and furniture and materials, to intangible, which is now people, IP, software, it is wholly driven by the human capital experience. And so for me, the learn was I shouldn't have to convince a CEO that this is a good program, but I want to make sure that whatever I'm doing, I'm connecting it to our business results. So instead of saying, hey, this is going to be a good people program for our employees, I'm going to say instead, actually, this is going to help us increase our revenue. Or if we do this, to a certain degree, it connects to our bottom line as a company. We're going to increase productivity, all these sort of things. So with all the data that's out there now, it's great that we don't necessarily have to overall say, is the HR role important or the HR effort important? But even individually, making sure that we're connecting these things to the business results of our individual companies is going to be super important. And that was something I learned over time.
Now I want to come to Ella, the engineer, Anthony. So tell us, who is Ella, the engineer?
So Ella is a character I created. So years ago, I have 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy, and I noticed a huge gap in the amount of women that were going into, particularly in this case, technology or software engineering. We're talking about probably 10 or 15 years ago. And just something that was itching. I read a report, I think it was a Gina Davis Institute report on this, and it was I thought it was something specific to our company. I actually ran a report of the company that I worked for at the time. We had thousands of engineers across the world, across the globe. And I did a pivot table, and I was looking at gender, and I thought I did something wrong with the pivot table. So I ran it again because there was just, of 1,000 plus employees, there were like a handful, 2 or 3 that were women. It was just like, it was so wrong in terms of the imbalance that I actually ran it a couple of times because I thought I did something wrong. There was just too few women in this career. So that night I went home and my kids were fairly, my oldest was probably 10 at the time. And I said, and she had an iPhone. We were big believers in giving tech to our kids early on, which for another reason may not have been the right decision, but it is what it is. I asked her, I said, do you know what that phone is all about? Do you know how that operates? And she didn't have an idea. And it kind of just spawned. And I was like, you know what? Maybe what we need to do is educate the kids, instead of us trying to identify women to hire, why don't we go earlier in the careers of these young girls? And media is such a powerful presence in the life of everyone, right? So, there was studies done. There was a show years ago, Ally McBeal, which had a female lead lawyer. And the amount of women that actually started going into law school went up by 20 or 30%. So media has a huge impact on our behaviors as a society. And I said, what if I can create a hero, a techie girl that saves the day in comic book or cartoon format? Imagine the amount of impact that's going to have going forward. And thus Ella the engineer was born. I created this character. She's a coder. She's a technologist. She has an arch nemesis called Glitch, because anytime something doesn't work, we say it's glitching. Yeah. So he's a digital mischief, and he'll go in and create chaos in her town and all the tech in her town. And they call her up to fix it. And, at the time, Barbie had made a couple of missteps with girls in coding. And so it was a perfect time to launch this. So we launched a bunch of comic books around this character, found a great partner in Deloitte Consulting, who has also helped us put together 5 or 6 more comics, a graphic novel. They put together videos. Deloitte has been such an incredible partner on this. And so it's a comic book series right now. You can go to the ellaproject.com. You can download the comics for free on PDF. And now we're starting to work with the Gina Davis Institute on pitching an animated series to studio at some point. So it's been evolving over time, and hopefully, fingers crossed, a studio picks it up and we get sort of the animation. Because eventually what I want to do, my end goal is a movie. I think global movie presence will have a greater impact on the amount of girls going into STEM or tech. And so that's our ultimate goal, but we're getting there through baby steps.
Incredible. What was it like seeing your own kids reading the book?
It was great. I mean, my own kids are, the greatest treasure on earth is the feedback from your own kids, because it's radically candid. And so I love the feedback from them. So it was great to see them. They were contributing, first draft of the comic book, they would look through and read, and so they're all contributing producers on every comic book, on everything that we're doing. My oldest now, Nicolette, is co-founder of the Ella Project, and my son and my daughter are also, advisors. So anything that we do script-wise, they read, they provide feedback. So they've been involved in this since the very beginning. When I received a video of a mom reading it to her kid, that wasn't obviously my child, that was when I was like, oh, this is actually making an impact early on. And that was really rewarding to see, and continues to give me the motivation to keep pushing, because entertainment's not easy. It's not an easy business, and I know nothing about it. And so I'm lucky to have people around me that know the business and support.
Selfishly, Anthony, anytime I meet someone who's a parent, given I'm going to be a first-time parent in a couple of months' time, I'm using the opportunity to get any words of wisdom. So what's that one nugget of advice you'd share for a new parent to be?
Well, congratulations. If you read the book by Peter Zion, which is all about demographics, continuing to build and have children are going to be increasingly important in this world. But also, okay, if your decision is not to have a child, advice is we're all making it up. We're all making it up. Like, there are plenty of books. You're going to read a ton of books. You're going to be nervous. Everyone is making it up as they go. And so don't be so nervous. Don't overread. Be natural. You're going to react. You're going to make mistakes. It's kind of the way it works. And you're going to be an imperfect parent. and your kid is going to be absolutely fine. So yeah, don't try to over engineer things, just sort of be natural. And the only thing is just make sure it's amazing. Excuse me. It's amazing when you're not a parent and then all of a sudden you become a parent, how much you can love another, of course you love your partner, whatever, your relationship is, you always have that kind of love, but until this child comes out, you're never going to know how much you could potentially love something in this world. And it's the greatest thing in the entire world. And it's the most challenging.
Before we jump onto the quick fire round, Anthony, I have to ask you about your book. What made you take the crazy decision of writing a book? Who does that?
It's people with a lot of time on their hands. So COVID was, we couldn't really go out anywhere. And so I started doing voice to text on my phone of things that I was thinking about. Years ago, my dad worked for the same company. I redact the name of the company to save the innocent. But he worked for the same company his entire life, started in the mailroom and eventually became controller in their accounting department, which is the connection to why I took accounting in college, because my dad told me it would be a good thing. And so he was, at the end of his career, required to reapply for his own job and forced into retirement. And I just felt like there's this unwritten contract between employees and employers that had existed for so many years. And again, if you're a historian on these things, it was this agreement where it's like, hey, if you give me work, I'll give you money, but I'll also build a community. A lot of companies were community based and they cared about the community and they cared about the people. And it wasn't a family. I never wanted a company to be a family, but it felt more than just this sort of transactional. Now, what has happened is because we became so very transactional in the 70s and 80s, the requirements from boards to CEOs were short-term gains. And so this is why you're seeing the proliferation of layoffs during this first half of the year, because we're all focused on short-term gains. That contract has eroded. That contract between employee and employers has eroded. And so I wanted to make a statement on that, because I think as I looked at and researched Gen Z, and we used actually the Suzy platform, which is a market research platform, to research Gen Z and what they wanted, a lot of that contract, that original contract of like, hey, if you care about me, I'll care about you, is really what, at the culmination of the research, what they wanted. And so these two worlds lined up perfectly. And I said, okay, I can make a statement on how I think the contract needs to change, but also provide all these companies advice for this next generation that's coming into the workforce. Because there was no book. I remember with millennials, that when they came in, there was no book. No one had an idea to say, hey, we were all surprised that this generation wanted something different than the previous generation. And there's a lot of similarities. I want to be clear. There's a lot of similarities into the wants and needs of each generation, but there are very clear differences. And I wanted to capture that. So COVID, had a lot of time. I voiced to text, had a great editor, and published a book. And it's been fun.
Incredible achievement. Just on the new employee contract, what do you think the impact of remote and hybrid working has been on that contract? Right? Do you think, just talking about transactional, how that relationship how transactional it used to be kind of 20, 30 years ago? Do you think that's starting to creep in more now because of the whole remote hybrid, or do you think it all is good?
No, I think it's less hybrid and remote. I think it's more of the macroeconomic environment. So, the pressures on, and again, I don't blame the CEOs at all. Their bonuses are based on their quarterly earnings because their investors are interested in, and the investors are interested because the LPs, the limited partners are in, so it's this whole chain of events that if we can say, like, listen, if we commit to our employees over time, we'll create company value, but we're very short-term focused. So what has happened is, I think it's more of the macroeconomic environment where it's saying, okay, and I think because of some of that macroeconomic environment, the pendulum of leverage has shifted. So years ago, it was employers, right? When I joined the workforce as a Gen Xer, take anything that you can. The employer has the power position. You do not. If you don't want to do this, there'll be three other people behind you. Well, now over the past couple of years, it's been very talent focused. Like, no, you have 3 or 4 job offers. There's plenty of not enough people and plenty of jobs out there, and we're still seeing some of that. It's still very much a talent market, but it's shifting back to the employer now with all these reductions in force and these rifts. So I think we're seeing a pendulum switch, which is or shift, which is now giving employers the opportunity to go, hey, maybe this remote thing doesn't work. I think, it depends on your company. That's my answer. But it also depends, I think, on your level. As you're more experienced, you may have more autonomy, where maybe more junior employee can use more of that in-person training and guidance. You have to be very intentional. That's the key, right? So if you're in a virtual environment, you have to make sure that you're constantly giving that employee feedback, that junior employee that's just starting with you, that maybe just starting out in his or her career or their career. Whereas maybe someone more experienced understands how this works and you can give them more autonomy. And I think it's not only experience, it's also intelligence. Like all these things need to be considered when thinking about, whether someone should be in an office or remote. But I think to me, I've always landed in the middle. I think it's a hybrid approach. I think, bringing people in is very rewarding, that human connection. But I also find that sometimes when you bring people into an office, their heads down working, what really interaction is there if they're just sitting next to someone else and just working? You have to be more intentional about what these different offices, these different hybrid locations are, what you're using them for.
Just want to ask about the writing process, Anthony. So I remember my first book came out last year, and I remember writing that was possibly one of the hardest things I did. I massively underestimated it. I think when my publisher said, "Can you get it done in 6 months?" I was like, "I can get it done in 3. Don't worry about it." It took me a year in the end. But what surprised you about the writing process? And apart from obviously the Ella project, was this your first time writing a book?
It was my first time. And on the Ella project, we had much smarter writers that were building the comic book episode. So I was more of like an executive producer on those. So thank goodness. So this was my first time with actually writing. Now I've been doing blogging and other videos and other things, so I'm not without opinion on certain things. So I found it very easy to, and again, I would do it voice to text, and then review what I wrote. The hardest thing was, and Steve Jobs talks about minimalism. The hardest part was taking stuff out. Like, so what do I eliminate? Because every idea was a baby, right? It's like, no, like this is a great idea. Like we should keep it in here. So that was the hardest part. And having an editor in that process to basically go, well, I see the holistic view of what you're trying to say, and this doesn't, even though it's a great idea, let's table that. And what I found to be really helpful was it wasn't deleting that idea. It was tabling that idea for book number 2, which I don't think I'll do ever again. Because I found like the writing part, again, with the great editors, not super easy, but not super challenging. To me was like what you saw when the Zoom started here. Selling the book to me is the hardest part because I'm too humble. I'm like, why would people want to read my book? So, but yeah, I think it's the elimination of things in a book. It was the hardest part.
All right, we're going to jump into the last section, Anthony, which is the quick fire. I'm going to throw a few questions at you. You can give me a quick answer. That'd be great.
Okay.
You're the CPO at Suzy. Looking forward, what excites you?
Yeah, I mean, AI. I mean, the impact of AI, not only on our business as a product, and what that capability could do, but also internally.
What concerns you? What's the biggest challenge you see for CPOs in general looking forward?
I think it's balancing the business needs with the people. And instead of focusing just on people, we need to really be focusing on people and performance. And I think that usually trips up a lot of CPOs.
What's your favorite productivity hack?
Time boxing.
All right, elaborate. How do you use time boxing?
So basically put my whole calendar into half hours and locking up time, whether it's my calendar or putting things to do and making sure that I have in there Slacks, emails, making sure I have all this mapped out in a time box. So it's basically you go through your day per hour and then split it by every half hour and making sure that everything that I'm doing ties to one of my overall goals. And if it doesn't, why am I doing that? What's the benefit of doing that? So being really, really hyper strategic about my calendar and how I operate.
Do you set personal goals?
Not explicitly. There are wants and desires that I have that I'll definitely write down, but I don't have. It's kind of, there was I forget who it was. I think he was a sports figure that said that the punishment of setting a goal is hitting it. Oftentimes you can actually exceed the goal if you don't set it. So I kind of bring that more into my personal life. Like I kind of put energy into the universe of something that I want. And then if an answer is back, I'll focus on it. But not necessarily put too many goals together. Waking up every morning at my age is number one goal. Yeah.
Favorite book or podcast or both?
So I love Think Again by Adam Grant, one of my favorite authors. And I just love his position on, hey, if new data comes in or new ways of thinking come in, don't sort of put your heels in the sand, like think again. And I think it's it's great advice for everything.
Best piece of advice someone's given you or you've given someone?
So Artie Nathan, who ran HR for Wynn Resorts, said, always tie what you're doing to business. Always, like, figure out a way, even if it's, not directly correlated, every effort, every breathing second, making sure that whatever you're doing, and if it doesn't tie to business, figure out how it does, and make sure that that's explicit. And I thought that was great advice.
And the last one for you today, Anthony, is what are you most proud of?
Excuse me. My kids. I think, all the things I do, CPO at Suzy, the book, Ella the engineer, hopefully maybe that'll live on past my due date. But really my legacy as a human being is my kids, and making sure that they're equipped not only to be smart and bright and be successful, but also be good humans and have a positive impact on the world. And so for me, I'm most proud of them.
And I feel like we've just scraped the surface and we could do another 5 episodes. But thank you very much for taking the time out and for jumping on the show.
Thank you, Nelson. It's been fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to another brilliant episode of L&D Disrupt, the podcast that's powered by How Now. Our learning experience platform helps companies bring relevant learning and skills into the flow of work to make meaningful learning a part of everyday work. But don't just take our word for it. Here's what some of our customers have to say. And if you like what you hear and want to learn more about How Now, just use the link in the description to book a demo. As a loyal L&D Disrupt listener, we'll send you a swag pack containing a copy of the book Learning at Speed and some How Now merch once we've shown you around.
And we needed somewhere to have a central home for all of the learning content that was being created at pace. And we also really wanted to support a modernised learning. So moving to that 70-20-10 model, where learning is really integrated into the flow of work at the point of need. And we knew that How Now would be the perfect platform to support with that modernised approach.
And I was confident that How Now was right for FitFlop because it passed the eyeball test at the Learning Technologies Conference, number one. Does it look like it's going to be user-friendly and people might actually want to use it? My previous companies, I'm used to using very clunky LMSs that don't do much to help with engagement.
We've just launched How Now, actually, where I am at the moment with Lucid Group. And what we've focused on is the building of habits around learning. So trying to get people into healthy and regular habit of learning so that it becomes an everyday activity as opposed to something they have to take lots of time out. We're very time poor. The tools they've got, the information they need is where they need it at the point. So integrating into Microsoft Teams as we use it or any other collaboration tool, making sure that any learning is accessible at their point of need. So where they can ask a search first question and then we can provide them the information they need straight away.